If you heard screaming inside a quiet church on a Sunday morning, you'd expect maybe a heart attack, not the roar of a lioness. Father Thomas had just finished his sermon, wiping sweat from his forehead as the final hymn echoed through the old wooden beams. He had been the priest in that small Alabama town for 27 years, never once missing a mass, even after his wife died, even when cancer nearly took his voice. That day, as sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, he was about to lock the doors when a violent sound shattered the silence. Chairs scraped, a woman screamed, and then it came, deep, guttural, raw, a roar. He froze in place, eyes scanning the chapel in disbelief. The congregation had already left, but something moved in the far aisle. Low, sleek, golden. At first he thought it was a dog. Then she looked up. A lioness, ribs showing through her dusty fur, her eyes wild and wet like a cornered soul. She limped forward, leaving a smear of blood behind her, and collapsed beneath the altar like she had come home. The air turned still. Father Thomas didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. He hadn't seen a lion in person since his seminary days in Kenya, 30 years ago, when he was young and still believed suffering always had meaning. But here she was, a vision straight out of a nightmare or prophecy. Outside, the quiet town ticked on, bakers kneading dough, children riding bikes, unaware that a predator had walked into God's house. He thought of locking the doors, calling animal control. But something in her eyes, something desperate and broken, held him in place. His heart pounded so hard he thought he might collapse. The church smelled of incense, old wood, and now, something else. Blood, fear. He reached for the phone by the pulpit but stopped mid-motion. The lioness lifted her head and looked directly at him, not as prey, but as if begging. Her whole body shook. A trail of red painted the marble floor. She had been running from something, or someone. The sound of distant sirens broke through the silence, probably unrelated. Still, it made her jerk to her feet, snarling through her pain. He instinctively raised his hands, not in fear but in benediction, the way he would bless a dying man. She hesitated, tilted her head. For a second, everything in the world stilled. A moment outside time. He whispered, "Peace, peace, child." Outside, a car door slammed. The lioness crouched, ready to run again. But her legs trembled, buckled. She dropped, panting, twitching with exhaustion. Father Thomas took a step forward, then another. She didn't move, only watched. His hands shook as he knelt beside her, close enough to smell the wild on her. Earth, blood, something ancient. She didn't flinch. In the quietest voice he'd ever used, he asked, "Who did this to you?" Of course she couldn't answer, but something in him needed to say it. The wound across her side was deep and jagged like barbed wire or a blade. No hunter would leave a creature like this alive, unless they meant for her to suffer. She wasn't just lost, she had escaped. He touched her paw, big as a dinner plate. Her claws were retracted but caked with dirt and something darker. The way she blinked, slow, deliberate, felt almost human. She was dying, but she had come here, to the church. Why? Did she sense sanctuary? Had she known mercy before, somewhere? Suddenly, a loud bang from the back door. She growled low, a rumble like thunder in her chest. But Father Thomas turned and placed himself between her and the noise. Whoever or whatever was coming. She wasn't alone anymore. A man in his 60s, grieving and nearly broken, and a lioness who had bled her way to the altar. Whatever happened next, neither would ever be the same again. The doors creaked open behind him. Heavy boots, shouts. But he didn't move. He stood tall, hands still raised, not in surrender but in faith. The lioness didn't snarl, didn't run. She looked at him once more, and this time she closed her eyes. The voices grew louder. Two men stepped inside. Ranch hands by the look of their boots, mud-caked and worn. One held a tranquilizer rifle, the other a rope coiled around his shoulder like a snake. They froze when they saw Father Thomas standing between them and the lioness, arms outstretched like he was shielding a child. "She's injured," he said calmly but firmly. "She came here for shelter. You're not taking her out like this." The man with the rope sneered. "Father, that's a wild animal. It could kill you." The other raised his rifle an inch higher, taking aim. "She's a damn escapee from that exotic breeder out past Route 9. They found 3 cages cut open this morning. 1 lioness missing. She's dangerous." Father Thomas didn't flinch. "She's in pain," he repeated, "and terrified. You shoot her in here, you don't just end a life, you desecrate a sacred space." The lioness was barely breathing now. Her flanks rose and fell in shallow gasps, each one slower than the last. Blood soaked the floor beneath her, pooling around her paws. Still, she didn't growl, didn't move. She trusted him. Or maybe she'd just given up. The man with the rifle glanced at his partner. "We don't have time for this priestly nonsense. What if she lashes out? What if someone else comes in?" Father Thomas turned. His voice cracked, but it didn't shake. "I've buried my wife. I've buried 2 parishioners this month alone. You think I'm afraid of death?" He stepped closer to the lioness, kneeling beside her again. "I've spent my whole life preaching compassion. I won't let her die terrified and alone on this floor. If you're going to shoot her, you'll have to shoot through me." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The men looked at each other, then at the lioness, then back at the priest. The one with the rope finally lowered his hands. "We ain't killers. We just came to bring her back, alive if we can. But she's bleeding bad. She won't last long like this." Father Thomas nodded slowly, a flicker of hope igniting in his tired eyes. "Then help me save her." They laid down the rifle and approached cautiously. One unzipped a small kit, gauze, antiseptic, needle and thread. Not meant for lions, but all they had. The lioness moaned softly as they began to work, and Father Thomas kept his hand on her paw the whole time, whispering prayers, telling her she was safe, that she was not alone. Her body trembled under their touch, but she didn't strike. Maybe she understood. Maybe she had known only cruelty before this. Or maybe she was too weak to resist. Either way, something changed in that chapel. The walls that had heard only hymns and confessions now bore witness to something primal, something holy. They cleaned the wound as best they could. It wasn't enough. She needed a vet. Real tools, real help. Father Thomas stood and faced the men again. "Take her, but not back to that breeder. Not to any cage." The man with the rifle raised an eyebrow. "You got a better idea, Padre?" Thomas nodded. "There's a wildlife sanctuary north of here. I baptized the woman who runs it. She owes me a favor." With a grunt, they lifted the lioness onto a canvas stretcher, her body limp but breathing. As they carried her out, Father Thomas walked beside her, one hand still resting gently on her shoulder. She didn't stir, but she didn't growl either. As they stepped out into the sun, neighbors had gathered, eyes wide. Whispers, gasps, a lion in the arms of men, and a priest walking beside her like she was a lost lamb. No one could understand yet what had really happened. They saw only danger averted, a beast tamed, but for Father Thomas it was more than that. It was redemption. It was the return of something he thought he had buried with his wife. The belief that even in the darkest moments, grace could still find a way in. The drive to the sanctuary took just under 2 hours, but it felt longer. The lioness drifted in and out of consciousness in the truck bed, a thin sheet covering her body to keep her warm. Father Thomas rode in the back with her, knees sore from kneeling, hands sticky with dried blood. He had never felt closer to death, or to life. Each time her chest rose, he whispered another prayer, afraid that breath might be her last. At the sanctuary gate, a woman in jeans and boots waited with 2 volunteers in a stretcher. Her name was Helen, and she had run the place for 17 years. "I thought you were joking," she said, eyes wide as they unloaded the injured lioness. "Then I saw your name and knew it had to be something wild." She crouched beside the animal, her trained hands gentle but firm. "She's been through hell. Let's see if we can bring her back." Inside the infirmary, they worked in silence. Father Thomas stood in the corner, watching as Helen and her team cleaned, stitched, and stabilized the lioness. They ran fluids, checked for infection, and shaved the fur around her wounds. Her body was littered with scars, not just from the escape, but from years of mistreatment. It was clear she had been a prisoner. "She's not just hurt," Helen said softly. "She's been tortured." That night, Father Thomas refused to leave. He sat beside her in the straw-covered enclosure, separated by a steel barrier, but closer than he'd ever felt to another soul in years. He talked to her, not as a priest, but as a man. He told her about his wife, about the cancer, about how the church felt emptier every year. He admitted he had prayed for something, anything, to wake him up again. "I didn't expect it to have claws," he said with a sad smile. By morning, the lioness stirred. Just a twitch, then a blink. Her eyes opened slowly, and she turned her head toward him. Father Thomas stood, heart pounding. She didn't growl, didn't move to run, just watched him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two survivors. Two beings who had lost too much and found something unexpected in return. Helen noticed. "She responds to you," she said, a note of awe in her voice. "That's rare. Usually they don't trust anyone, not for months. Whatever happened between you two, it matters." From that day forward, Father Thomas came daily. He brought food, sat quietly, read aloud from books. Scripture, yes, but also poetry, old letters, things his wife used to love. He didn't need her to understand. He just needed to be near. Word spread quickly. The local news ran a story. Priest shelters lion in his church. The footage of him blessing her beside the altar went viral. People called him a saint. Others called him crazy. But he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt needed. Not just as a shepherd to a flock, but as a companion to a wounded creature the world had discarded. Some visitors came to the sanctuary just to see the lioness. Most left humbled, quiet. She had a presence, a stillness that made you feel your own heartbeat. Helen eventually gave her a name, Grace. Not for what she is, she explained, but for what she's given. And slowly, Grace began to heal. She gained weight. Her eyes grew clearer. The limp faded, but she never took her eyes off Father Thomas for long. Then one afternoon, something incredible happened. As he entered her enclosure for the first time, slowly, under Helen's supervision, Grace stepped forward, not to attack, not to flee, but to press her head gently against his chest, a full-body lean, a gesture of complete trust. Helen gasped. The volunteers froze. But Father Thomas just wrapped his arms around her, tears slipping down his cheeks. For the first time in a long time, the church bells rang that Sunday with a new sound. Not just duty, not just routine, but joy. The kind that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do, even if it's something no one else understands. Months passed, seasons shifted. The church still held its Sunday services, and Father Thomas still stood behind the altar. But something in him had changed. He no longer lingered at the edges of life, quietly grieving his past. Now, between sermons and funerals, he spent his afternoons at the sanctuary. With Grace, the lioness had become a fixture there, no longer just a patient but a presence. Strong, watchful, and serene. She was no longer confined to the infirmary. Her new enclosure stretched across a wide field bordered by trees and sunshine. Father Thomas often stood near the fence, sometimes with a book, other times just silently watching her walk the perimeter with a calm that hadn't existed before. Volunteers joked that she paced like a monk, making rounds of reflection. "She's become more priest than predator," Helen once laughed. Visitors from all over the country came to see her, but the ones who stayed quiet, who didn't pose for selfies or shout her name, were the ones she seemed to notice most. Grieving widows, veterans with missing limbs, children who had stopped speaking. Grace would sit near the edge of her fence, meeting their gaze with something deep and ancient. She didn't roar anymore. She didn't have to. Father Thomas began holding monthly prayer gatherings at the sanctuary. Not sermons, not lectures, just circles of people and silence. He called it the Grace Hour. No chairs, no microphones, just breathing, listening, and the occasional low growl in the distance that reminded everyone they were not alone. "She doesn't just remind us of pain," he told them. She reminds us of what can rise from it. He stopped wearing his clerical collar every day, started gardening, writing, laughing more. He invited Helen and her staff to dinner, cooked old recipes from his childhood, and sometimes left fresh meat at the gate just because he liked the thought of Grace enjoying something without struggle. There were still scars on both of them, visible and invisible, but neither was defined by them anymore. One morning, a local school sent drawings from their second-grade class, dozens of crayon portraits of Grace and the Lion Priest. One had big block letters scrawled across the top. She found God in the church. He found her in the wild. Father Thomas taped it to his office wall, looked at it every day. It wasn't theology, it was truth. Eventually, the breeder from Route 9 was charged and shut down. The case had dragged for months, but the public outcry and Grace's story had sparked a movement. Exotic animal regulations were revisited, and new laws passed bearing her name. Grace's law prohibited the private ownership of large cats in the state. It was justice in a way. Late, but not hollow. On the anniversary of the day she limped into the church, Father Thomas stood beside her once more. She was lying under her favorite oak tree, belly rising slowly in the warm breeze. He knelt beside her, not as protector, not as priest, but as friend. "You came to me when I was too afraid to ask for help," he whispered. "And you never left." She blinked, slow and calm, then pressed her great head gently into his hand. And for a long time they stayed that way, two beings once broken, now whole, not because they were healed, but because they had been seen, accepted, loved. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying his final words to her like a benediction. "You didn't just survive, you saved me."